Very much, Darren. Can everybody hear me? First of all, I have quite a loud voice and I like to move around, so I tend not to stay married to the mic. I'll just start by going through the kind of jump point for this study, which was the bailout. And I know Darren was saying that there's been presentations in the last couple of weeks on regulation and rules, and I'm afraid I'm going to start by taking you right back to that point. So the starting point for this project was actually the analysis of the fallout from the bailout, and there were two major sources of analysis that emerged in late 2010, early 2011, when everyone was obviously panicking. And the first was the official reports by Patrick Hourigan, Rob Wright, Klaus Reckling, Matt Watson, Peter Nyberg, which very much focused on weak rules, poor regulation, the role of the financial regulator, principles-based regulation. So there's one quote here from Peter Nyberg, which I think kind of encapsulates a lot of that critique, was that adhering to either formal or traditional, often voluntary rules, constraints and limits on banking and finance does not seem to have been greatly valued in Ireland during the period, and this was the period coming up to the bailout. The second source of analysis of what went wrong, so to speak, was a whole series of books, many published for the popular general interest market, on I suppose, relationships and the role of relationships between bankers, property developers and politicians. One quote here from Fintan O'Toole's book, Ship of Fools, he says, an atmosphere of insider intimacy in which cronyism thrived continued to hang over real-time Ireland. So we saw a lot of those books focus on things like the famous Galway tent and sources of this, I suppose, corruption / cronyism, given we have quite a loose definitions of corruption in the Irish context. Now, I thought this was really interesting because essentially Elaine Byrne's book on political corruption in Ireland, which was published in 2011, showed that there was actually quite a high level of public awareness of concerns around cronyism for a long time, travelling right through the period of tribunals. But interestingly, this hasn't actually made a huge impact on people's voting choices. So for instance, she quotes an MRBI poll taken in 1991, which said a total of 89% agree that there's a golden circle of people in Ireland who are using power to make money for themselves. Some 81% agreed that the people in this golden circle were made up in equal measure of business people and politicians. But as we know, the tribunals produced very little in the way of formal sanction, and indeed some people who were sanctioned actually got re-elected after being sanctioned. So I suppose I was intrigued by this, partly because I was actually teaching first-year sociology, and some of this was emerging. And there's a kind of interesting tension in the very basic part of like say Durkheim. I also see it in Tony's in terms of his anthropology. So the three questions which emerged as I was looking at this analysis, and they're the questions which informed this project, was number one, was the tension between weak rules and strong relationships, which I think we can see identified in this analysis, was that more widely reflected in the values of the Irish middle classes? Two, did this tension, as Durkheim in particular suggests, inform differing moral visions, different visions of good and bad behaviour in society? And finally, had the necessary, or was the necessary pain of austerity, which was going to be inflicted as a result of this calamity, was that going to change the tension? And as I say, this theme we see in your kind of, in Durkheimian sociology, in Tony's work. We also see it in the work of comparative philosophers like Thomas Kazoulis, which talk about the kind of reiterative orientation of society, either towards rules or relationships. And I was particularly interested in the way some of those themes were coming up in contemporary anthropology, and particularly the work of Michael Hertzfeld on Crete, which obviously there was lots of Ireland-Greece comparisons going on in 2010, if you remember. And he was drawing on the work of people like Amber Cohen and Schmel, Eisenstadt, which very much focused on cultural intimacy. And particularly he highlighted how elites often essentially establish their power base, political elites, by being both masters of cultural intimacy and masters of rules. There's one great quote from his book, Cultural Intimacy, which could have been written about the Galway tent. He says, the formal operation of national states depends on coexistence with various realizations of cultural intimacy. In the intimacy of a nation's secret space lies at least some of the original models of official practice. People recognize as familiar, everyday phenomenon some of officialdom's most formal devices, and this generates active skepticism about official claims and motives. So that was one area of kind of contemporary anthropology, which I felt could inform the type of analysis that I was trying to do. Another, I suppose, contemporary thinker within sociology that I felt could inform it was the work of Andrew Sayre, who's based in Lancaster. And he was very interesting, particularly in terms of his work on class and the more recent work on why things matter to people, in bringing normativity back into sociology. So how our evaluations of what's good and bad can frame how we behave. He says the most important questions and concerns people tend to face in their everyday lives are the normative ones of how to act, what to do for the best, what is good or bad about what is happening, including how others are treating them and the things which they care about. We usually behave in a certain way because we sense that it is right, regardless of whether there are any penalties for not doing so. So one of the things he was trying to highlight is that there is a normative sensibility, which we sometimes also see called something like everyday morality, which can exist outside the formal rules of religion, which can exist outside the law, but can nevertheless quite strongly inform how people behave, particularly in everyday contexts where there may not be formal rules which apply. And I felt that everyday morality was something that could be looked at in terms of the types of issues that I wanted to investigate. A kind of third pillar of the kind of theoretical framework for this research was the work of Thomas Kazoulis, who argued that he's a comparative philosopher which focuses very much on kind of East-West cultural differences, particularly in terms of precisely that type of everyday morality that Sayre was talking about. And he created a tension between what he called intimacy and integrity, or what could also be extrapolated to rules and relationships. And he argued that in his work he could identify two different moralities, a morality linked to rules, or integrity as he called it, and a morality linked to relationships. So what's the morality linked to rules? And he argued that the rules-based view of the individual in terms of their location in culture recognizes their separateness from everyone else. So under rules, all of us are often regarded as kind of individuals with responsibility for our own behaviour. And then the kind of moral basis for behaviour is that if an act is to truly respect the separateness and wholeness of the other person, the individual who commits it should be happy if that act was reversed and applied to them. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And then taking that respect to another level, drawing on Kant, is the idea that it's not just that we would be willing if the act was reversed to have it applied to us, but that we would be willing if the act was reversed to have it applied to everyone. So basically do unto others as you would have them do unto everybody. And of course that is where the fairness comes in. Because how do you ensure that fairness? And of course rules are the way. In theory, why do we create a rule? If I say, right, the rule for lunchtime in this room is that everybody gets 2 sandwiches. Okay, some people might want 6, some people might want 1, but because everybody gets 2, at least you're ensuring some kind of fairness. So the moral demand at the core of this is to be fair. Okay, now as you know, realize rules don't often end up being fair, but nevertheless, that's where we start. Now, the morality of relationships starts with a different view of the individual in society, in culture. And it's a view which emphasizes how much their identity overlaps with others. So my definition of myself is not so much about separateness and wholeness, but about how much my identity depends on how other people perceive me and value me. And in that kind of context, the trouble of another that I'm in relationship with, affects me in a very personal way. So this comes back to the idea of I love thy neighbour as you love yourself, which would be in Christianity, Buddhism, etc. And then the primary moral demand in this morality of intimacy or relationships is the demand to be there for others. So if my sense of myself very much depends on other people and how other people view me, then my the primary moral demand is to be there for others. So Kazoulis concludes by highlighting what he regarded as these two competing moralities: the morality of rules, which emphasizes being fair, and the morality of relationships, which emphasizes being there for others. And one of the things he concludes is that often it is the history of a society which shapes whether they lean to what he calls these reiterative orientations of being there or being fair. So the next step I did was say, well, right, let's look at Irish history and see what are the elements of our culture or our history, which might make us lean either towards rules or relationships. So obviously the starting point for me in this would be colonialism, and we see this in a lot of work on cultural intimacy, particularly Eisenstadt's work. And one of the problems with colonialism is that colonizers tend to set up the rules to suit themselves and their own agendas. So often those who are being subjected to colonial administration are automatically predisposed to view rules as being unfair and in many cases not particularly legitimate. And we can see a lot of these attitudes in Ireland around tithing, around, we can see them emerge in the campaign for Catholic emancipation. We can see them around the time of the Act of Union and discussions of corruption at that time. But I would argue, and the work I draw on argues, that the trauma of colonialism actually impacts on attitudes to rules in a deeper way. And the work that I'm drawing on here is very much the work on cultural trauma and colonialism, which links, I suppose, the individual experience of trauma to experiences of trauma at a collective level. And if we look at the individual experience of trauma, one of the things that we know is work on child abuse, and particularly complex trauma, is that if somebody is in an abusive situation, if a child is in an abusive situation, this kind of dissociative process occurs, where there's one part of them that is focused on dealing with the abuser, right, in a way to manage the situation, to minimize the abuse, and then the other part of their psyche essentially becomes the repository of their real feelings. So you get this process of dissociation, and we can see this. There's a number of scholars who've argued that you see this in colonized societies at a collective level. You can see it perhaps in the practice in Ireland of tipping the cap, particularly at the time of, say, secret societies, where on one hand you had people outwardly demonstrating a kind of a politeness or an honouring of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, and at the same time then at night stealing out and burning houses or, engaging in acts of violence. And Vincent Kenny actually, in quite a neglected piece in the Crater Bag in 1985, writes about this split. And he says, in order to survive, one must appear to be superficially compliant. Open rebelliousness tends to meet with immediately harsh measures. It is important to create an external image which reassures the oppressor that the status quo is being maintained. And I was particularly interested in the work of a Nigerian scholar called Peter Eke, who argued and who kind of interrogated how this split consciousness, for want of a better word, might impact on the balance between rules and relationships. So Eke essentially starts by arguing that while most societies have a split between public and private life, as a society which has been subjected to colonization has a further split in public life. And essentially there's two moralities operating in public life. In public activities which are linked to the colonizer, so bureaucracy, taxes, land registration, those are governed by rules. And breaking those rules is not that bad, because those rules are not regarded as being particularly legitimate anyway. But in public activity that is linked to the families and the communities of those who've been colonized themselves, that is regarded as being kind of morally important. And behaving badly in that context is sanctioned. So, for instance, there's one quote from his argument: government authorities with their civic structures have a sad record of muddle, corruption and strife. This is Nigeria he's writing about. Paradoxically, the ethnic unions, which would be almost similar to something like the GAA here in Ireland, who are directly linked to circles of intimacy, are handling sums of money comparable to those of many of the local authorities. and they are spending it constructively, and they are handling it honestly. So there's two different modes of operation in relation to rules and money going on. And this picks up on a piece by Wraith and Simpson in the 1960s, where they say, to put your fingers in the till of the local authority will not unduly unburden your conscience, and people may well think you a smart fellow and envy your opportunities. To steal the funds of the union would offend the public conscience and would ostracize you from society. So you are clearly breaking some kind of moral code when you do that. But of course, the interesting thing is that in Ireland, we haven't actually seen the levels of corruption that we've seen in some countries in sub-Saharan Africa where this type of research is done. So what are the things in Irish culture which might have also given us a commitment to rules? And I think they are not to be underestimated. The first thing I think is really important is the democratic tradition of Daniel O'Connell and Parnell. And I think O'Connell is particularly striking in that balance and his commitment to the law in particular at key moments. He demonstrated that. I also think the post-famine Catholicism of Cardinal Cullen and the devotional revolution, so the version of Catholicism which emerges in Ireland in the late 19th century, is very much focused on rules, on keeping rules, and it does get a buy-in from the population. Another thing which I think is important and maybe is slightly more underestimated is exams, and is the examination system which emerges in Ireland after the Intermediate Education Act in 1870. And we see there's a very striking level of take-up of second level education and examinations from that period onwards, which suggests that people did have some faith in the education system. But of course, interestingly, one of the rewards of doing exams and passing your exams was the opportunity to get work in the emerging Irish public sector at the time. And even within the British colonised state, the public sector was expanding pretty rapidly in the late 19th and very early 20th century. But one of the things that Eka writes about, because of course you see similar processes in other former British colonies, is that process of entering the public sector comes at a certain psychological price. We see this mapped very clearly through the Clears work, where she talks about the way in which public sector workers, for instance teachers in local areas, were expected to dress a certain way, behave a certain way, live in certain quarters, essentially a kind of almost process of assimilation. But of course what that does is it challenges one's link back to family and community, which are the core repository of the real feelings in a colonised context. David Lloyd has written about this. So one of the ways that the bureaucrat can demonstrate that he's still loyal to family and community is by favours and turns, which of course Dermot Ferriter maps in his work on local government. So the psychological demands of public sector roles, the need to conform, this is kind of redressed by shoring up links through favours and through friends. The other thing, and I think this is kind of interesting in the light of the centenary of 1916, Eka highlights that final break with colonialism often requires a really intense push to delegitimise rules. So the struggle to break away entailed a necessary but destructive strategy, sabotage the administrative efforts of the colonisers. The African who evaded his tax was a hero. Such strategy, one must repeat, was a necessary sabotage against alien personnel whom the African bourgeois class wanted to replace. The irony of it all, however, is that the ordinary African took the principles involved in such activities quite seriously. And of course, it's very interesting if you map that period between 1916 and 1922 and the progressive level of non-cooperation with rule-based institutions in Ireland, like things like local government, like inland revenue, which happened during that period. And in some ways, with policing, which often made the state so unworkable for the British colonising class. So, that's then the historical background. Now, I actually started niggling around with this stuff before the bailout. And I had originally started this as a project looking at transformations of identity in Ireland in light of immigration. I was interviewing a lot of particularly working migrants and Irish workers and looking at the tension there. And the problem was that this theme of rules and relationships kept coming up so strongly in the research and I started to think, God, this is the thing that actually needs to be focused on. So there's actually 3 stages of the research. One that's kind of prior to the bailout, one which is around the time of the bailout, and one which is 2012 kind of ish. There's 5 locations: Cork, Dublin, Limerick, Laois and Tipperary. 166 interviews, 9 focus groups. There were a number of immigrants included in that. Participant observation of new political movements, many of which have fizzled out, obviously. I suppose one of the things that I wanted to focus on in that context was, because this is an ethnographic study, was the thorny methodological issue of how we generalise from ethnographic research, which is, is a huge methodological debate. I'm not going to get into it massively today, given our time constraints, but I will kind of clarify that my own position. You see people like Ethnographic who say you can only, in ethnographic work, talk about the exact population you study. Then you have people who make claims at the other end of the spectrum say you can generalise, you can make universal claims from ethnographic data. I'm somewhere in the middle here. I think you can make modest claims for generalisation from ethnographic research. But I would very much accept Martin Hammersley's kind of qualifications on that. And the first qualification he highlights is the need for detailed consideration of how closely the ethnographic study population reflects the profile of the more general population. And the more general core population I was looking at was middle classes. And in that context, I used the CSO's 2006 definitions. I also drew off the Great British Class Survey, Mike Savage's work. I excluded, obviously, residents of marginalised communities. I used the SIPO benchmarks to exclude elites. There was also stratification for gender, rural-urban divide, and the life course, which is a really key issue in terms of the middle class and their experience of austerity in Ireland. The second thing is Hammersley highlights is to acknowledge the temporal limitations of the study. So this is very much a reflection of the research that was done at the time. I would think even since then, we can say that things have changed, and we might talk a little bit about that towards the end. Okay, so what did I find anyway? After all this talking, and there was a lot of talking involved here. The first thing that I found there was, and I mean, Chris Whelan's research going back to the 90s on values in Ireland shows this, that there's very strong links between family relationships and goodness in the Irish value system, particularly in terms of things like having children, which has been highlighted by Margaret Fine Davies, spending and consumption. Kieran Cahan, Carmen Cooling have highlighted that. I also found a very strong link between contributing to community and being regarded as good. And I think in that context, it's interesting to highlight Sean Lestrange's work, where he highlighted how the Catholic Church in the 1930s in Ireland very much encouraged Irish people to view the community as the central focus for kind of outward active participation. So the person who goes out there and does good for their community is regarded as a good person. We see those understandings in things like tiny towns, in the community games, even the term like standing up for your community. The Local Heroes Project was part of austerity. And again, so I found that was again very strong in both urban and rural contexts. And it's striking that those associations continue to be so strong, considering how much definitions of the family have changed in Ireland, and indeed how much community has changed. If you look at Mary Corcoran's research in our suburbs, if you look at all the massive transformations of family, it's interesting that those associations with being good, so to speak, continue to be there. And these are all what I would consider to be intimacy-based groups. Okay, the association between the nation and being good was weaker. Again, over 90% reported feeling close to the nation. That would be something that we'd see in the ISSP survey from the 1990s. But I think the issue there was, I suppose, the Republican legacy here in Ireland is that is being a nationalist necessarily part of those being good behaviours that come so easily. Jennifer Todd has a brilliant study actually around the border area, where she highlights the way in which people in that area use the county as the route up to understanding their place in the nation. And I found that to be very powerful in the kind of GAA context. I'm sure you're aware that the championships in the GAA in Ireland are built on a 32 county model, and that, being proud of the county is kind of a route up to the nation. That was certainly strong, but it's strong in a very complex way. But I suppose really in trying to map this whole thing of culture and intimacy and morality, the term that I found most resonant, came up most frequently, was the one that was the kind of flagship signifier, was the term our own. Looking after our own, being one of our own, he's one of our own. 62% used the term our own to describe a relationship-based group to which they felt some kind of sense of moral obligation. So the use of the term our own was most strongly evident at the level of family, community, nation, but also existed in other contexts. So for instance, guards would often describe a guard who had been injured as he's one of our own. We saw it in sports clubs, lots of contexts. Our own in all these contexts had boundaries and could exclude other individuals or groups. So actually, Brian Fanning has a very interesting piece of research on local elections in Louth, where there's an immigrant candidate running, and the term our own turns up, and one immigrant makes a very interesting comment. He says, if he's canvassing in Dundalk, and the person comes to the door and they say, you know, we're voting for one of our own. But he has come to understand that one of our own doesn't just mean not him, it also means people not from Dundalk. Do you know what I mean? So that there's multiple layers of exclusion going on in our own. Being part of our own is moral obligations to other members of the group. Individuals can be part of a number of groups defined as our own and have differing levels of commitment to them. The moral obligations to other members of the group members weakens as the group gets larger and remote from the individual. A good person is the person who meets obligations to be there for other members of our own. We'll talk about that in a minute in terms of politicians in Ireland. And being there for other members of our own can take precedence over being fair to other people who are outside the group. This is the model that was kind of emerging from all this digging. Now, so for ordinary Irish people, not politicians, not elites, what were the kind of behaviours that were linked to being there for one of our own? And this was basically favours and turns. Getting a summer job or a part-time job for family members during school holidays, getting interviews for friends or for people who are part of our own, getting children into a primary school or a secondary school, providing special treatment for friends or family in service contexts like for restaurants, airports. So you see people like getting hotel rooms upgraded, getting in through A&E, those kind of favours. Getting a family member a room or a bed in a hospital, and getting family members or friends work in their own place of employment. So you can see that there's quite a strong link there. There's quite a lot of material benefits to being one of our own. And I also found that there was an awareness, particularly for people who are on the losing end of this, that had an impact on fairness. So this is Shane, and he's a young guard, and he says, me and my friend, let's call him Tom, both got transferred to Dublin after Templemore. We're both involved in local GAA teams at home, and we both were managed to get back down the country. Anyway, his uncle is a guard in Waterford, and he got onto the chief super, and at the end of the day, he got his transfer back down within an hour's drive of home, and I'm still here, basically. So there's a difference, essentially, in how they were treated. Interestingly, the immigrants I viewed were not universally critical of the process of being there for others as opposed to being fair. I kind of went in expecting them to be, but that was not the case. Firstly, because in many cases they were often being there for each other and doing the same behaviours for each other. The second thing is that often they were confronted with rules that weren't necessarily fair or responsive, and they themselves had to invoke those relationships to get past those rules. So this is one girl, Agatha. She said she had a problem with another girl in her flat, and an Irish person that she knew who had a relation, and the guard spoke up for her. And there were a number of those kind of incidences outlined where people highlighted the positive aspects of being there, so to speak. So now, the next layer that I was interested in looking at this was politics. And this was the level at which the people in the study were relating to their own local politicians. This is not Galway 10 stuff, big elite. This is so. The third interim report of the Joint Oireachtas Committee showed that Irish TDs spent 53% of their time on constituency work. This is basically doing favours for people, and 50% of that work involves making representations for local people. Now, 63% of people I interviewed were really critical of cronyism, particularly 2010, 2011. 29% could describe incidences where they had asked politicians themselves to do favours. That was kind of broadly in line with the national election study in 2002 that found that 1 in 5 voters had made contact with a TD in the previous 5 years, and also showed that 60% of voters wanted a local service for politicians. I interviewed 13 politicians at various levels and 5 experts in debt management, and interestingly, 80% of the politicians I interviewed said that the volume of constituency work that they were doing had actually increased after 2010, despite all the criticism of cronyism. And this was largely because they weren't just dealing with the public sector, they were also dealing with banks. If you think the rules of the public sector are not responsive or fair, you should have a look at banks, or maybe you already have. This is Fiona, a young Dublin TD. I think with the banks, people find them very complex to deal with. Like, I had a successful outcome where a woman was going on maternity leave and the bank was supposed to work out some arrangement for you, and this woman had sent all the paperwork to the bank and got no response. So I made representations and she got a response from them. So like the main issue was that the bank was not replying to the person. And you see a lot of those incidents coming up where banks were just ignoring people, essentially. One of the things that, so when I asked the people then who would say, well, I went to my local TD and I asked him for a favour, and I said, well, do you not think that that impacts on fairness? So if you get a medical card, that means somebody else can't have one. And this is the kind of comments I was getting. This is Sheila. I don't really care whether other people can get them or not. All I know is that I need one, and in our healthcare system, those who shout the loudest seem to get what they want. Those who do nothing or say nothing get nothing. You have to get in there and fight. You can do that by having all your forms and documents in order, but that's not enough. Even if you can get it right, you still need a bit of support on your side, and that's when the competition comes in. Bob says, bottom line, if a guy is going to help one of my children get a job somewhere or help me get a grant to do something, people are going to support him and vote for him regardless of what he's going to do at a national level. And certainly, the statistics will bear that out, is that politicians who focus on constituency work have the strongest chance of getting re-elected. Interestingly, politicians who have lost their seat spend 66% of their time doing constituency work, as opposed to politicians who have not lost their seat. They spend at least 10-50% more time in constituency work. Now, what did the politicians say? They actually were complaining. They felt that there was a breakdown in the turn for a vote exchange. So they felt that people were coming to them asking for favours and not necessarily following through with their vote. They talked about less face-to-face contact with people through clinics and local branch meetings. A lot more contact through social media. A lot of people were being kind of bombarded on social media. But generally, they kind of concurred with the voters. This is Connell. He says, if you weren't available for constituency work, you'd be a one-term TD, been and gone. It doesn't leave a whole lot of time for parliamentary work, and this is the whole problem. What one has to do is to try and balance the constituency work with the parliamentary work. It's difficult to balance the two. I've seen cases of brilliant parliamentarians religiously tackling legislation line by line and word by word, and they lose their seats because they didn't do the constituency work. And they were able to all highlight examples to me of individuals where that had happened. Now, this did lead to some interesting contradictions in attitudes, because there was so much anger about things like the Galway tent at the time, particularly in 2010, 2011. So this is Fergal, he's a doctor in North Cork. He says, I'm shocked at what austerity has done to our healthcare system. It was bad before, but now it's a complete disaster. I can't believe that our political leaders put the interests of bankers and developers before everyone else. Our local A&E is like a North Korean field hospital, and every time they send somebody down there, it makes me angry. But the footpath outside our clinic was a disgrace, and we're ratepayers. I brought it to the attention of the council and not a thing happened, so I emailed our local TD and he came down and had a look at it. We've patients in wheelchairs and people with all kinds of mobility issues, so access to the clinic is important. In fairness to him, he did get it sorted, and yes, I would probably vote for him. So there was that contradiction going on. So I'll just move on then. So the next level that I was interested in looking at then is the one that the original jump point, the cultural intimacy between elites, how that was linked to this more intimacy in everyday politics. And so if we start at the beginning here, one of the things we see is that there's actually quite low levels of corruption for the first 40 years of the state's existence. And there's a couple of things that seem to feed into that. First of that is the frugality of the revolutionary elite themselves, and the church's attitudes towards commerce and bling and splashing around your wealth, essentially. The interesting thing is that quite austere culture of the newly independent state, it did stabilise the state, it did give it a sense of identity, but what it didn't deliver was economic growth. So by the late 50s, you can stay facing a crisis because of massive levels of emigration. And what that leads to is quite a significant shift and change in economic policy, and along with it, in attitudes to entrepreneurs and entrepreneurialism. And one of the things that happens in the 60s, so you see this burgeoning new generation of entrepreneurs, is that the political elite start to recognise that the intimacy which they have previously doled out on the doorstep or at the parish pump, that this is something that effectively can be sold as a commodity to entrepreneurs. And Charlie Haughey, unsurprisingly, is the man who has this light bulb moment with the establishment of TACA in 1966, but then is swiftly followed by a number of others in Irish politics. And I think along with this, we do see in broader cultural terms in Ireland a celebration of the entrepreneur as the person who creates jobs. I think because I write about this trend, say for instance, something like the Late Late Show in Ireland in the 70s and 80s, where guys with startup businesses will come on and they talk about their new invention, and then your man is saying, well, how many jobs have you created? And of course the dividend of creating jobs was it keeps families and communities together, which is this core repository of goodness. So what's the difference then between the intimacy that we see on the doorstep, people getting onto their local TD to get their footpath fixed, and the Galway tent, the elite level intimacy that people like Shane Ross and people like Fintan O'Toole were highlighting? Well, the first thing, of course, is that the vote for the turn model can be accessed by anyone with a vote. And this is strongly linked to things like the loyalty in Irish political culture, which we see back in Chubb wrote about, but Michael Marsh has mapped it in his studies much more recently. The money or influence for the turn model can only be accessed by the wealthy and powerful, and it's usually accessed in kind of enclosed settings that you effectively have to buy your way into. The second thing is, while the turn for the vote engenders loyalty, what we do see in a number of contexts, particularly with very well-off individuals, is essentially that they're backing all the horses. So if you look at Dennis O'Brien, it's very interesting to look at the way in which he has actually contributed to all the major political parties in Ireland at certain periods of time. So you can see that the moral basis of the earlier form of intimacy has been undermined in the newer tradable commodity model. And one of the really serious things about that is why if we look at the everyday politics level of intimacy, what you see is rules being bent and rules being broken, at the elite level, what you see is rules being rewritten, which is things like the Export Credit Insurance Act, which was at the centre of the Beef Tribunal. We see the Assets Covered Security Act in 2007, which was a key factor in making most of Anglo much worse than perhaps it needed to be. So then the final question I had, well, does the necessary pain of austerity, has this changed any of this? Because there was a lot of sign of flux going on. The first thing is I found there was a very keen awareness that there was two sets of rules. One rule for some and one rule for others. Context for this was particularly highlighted was around debt. The difference between the way Niamh treated well-off debtors and developers and the way in which the Personal Insolvency Acts treated everyday debtors and mortgage arrears. Another one was justice. There was a pretty significant increase in the number of people who were imprisoned for non-payment of fines from 2010 onwards, at the same time as the number of bankers who are still walking around who've been involved in the bailout. But there was this sense that the rules should be fairer. So you saw at certain points anger against public figures who are engaged in tax avoidance, like Bono. You see a massive increase in the reporting of welfare fraud, and most interestingly, the penalty points controversy. So this is a very interesting example of a normative change where something that has been done fairly widespread and where people thought that's okay, suddenly becomes regarded as problematic in a relatively short period of time. But interestingly, in the first 8 months of 2015, Kerry politicians made 2,500 representations of medical cards to the HSE. So that would suggest that commitments to, despite all these concerns about rules and how they should be fairer, when people want to get the job done, certainly in Kerry, they're still going out there and they are engaging in the kind of cultural intimacy route. So in conclusion then, I think there is strong evidence to suggest that these two moral imperatives do exist. It influences the behaviour of the middle classes at an everyday level, and it does influence how they relate to politicians. I still think there's a disconnect as to how this cultural intimacy impacts on fairness, and that's still evidence. I mean, since this research has been completed, we've had increasing evidence of recovery, we've had increased social protest linked to water campaigns. We've also had the whole controversy about Dennis O'Brien and the loans of IRBC, or IBRC, excuse me. And we still see people using political intimacy to get what they want out of rule-based systems. So I think, you know, in terms of the questions that I had at the start of this project, I managed to answer them very effectively, but I don't think I'm particularly comforted by the answers that I got.